Moderna CEO Stéphane Bancel was grilled before the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions yesterday. Now, our next guest applied some of that grilling. He pressed the CEO on cases of myocarditis linked potentially to the COVID vaccine. Here's how he handled that. Let's watch.
You're saying that for ages 16 to 24 among males who take the COVID vaccine, their risk of myocarditis is less than people who get the disease.
That is my understanding, sir.
That is not true, and I'd like to enter into the record 6 peer-reviewed papers from the Journal of Vaccine, the Annals of Medicine, that say the complete opposite of what you say. I also spoke with your president just last week, and he readily acknowledged in private that, yes, there is an increased risk of myocarditis. The fact that you can't say it in public is quite disturbing.
I'm joined this morning by Senator Rand Paul. Senator Paul, it's great to have you back on Rising. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
And can you tell us more about the conversation you actually had with the Moderna president last week?
Well, sometimes, guest or part of a corporation will come in as a courtesy visit in advance. He came in, we had a very pleasant conversation, very cordial conversation, and very much a give and take on, whether or not this should be pushed on children versus those who are at higher risk. And the president in private assured me that their main goal was targeting for sales the people who are at higher risk. And I asked him things like there are some compromised positions. I frankly wouldn't vaccinate my children for COVID because I think the risks of the vaccine are greater than the risks of the disease. The risks of the disease are almost non-existent. But let's say your position is somewhere in between. You think 3 is too many. What about 1? Well, 90% of the myocarditis, which is admittedly rare, 90% of it comes after the second vaccine. Well, if your kid's already had COVID, I don't think they need it at all. But let's say you want to give them a vaccine and they've already had COVID, why not 1 instead of 3? So I think it really is malpractice, and this is a science where there is some evidence on both sides to debate. But for goodness sakes, I don't think there's any evidence to give your kid 3 vaccines, and that's what's being required because Fauci and other, folks in the public health community from the Biden administration, they come forward and say, oh, your kid needs 3. So University of Chicago, Harvard, Yale, all these supposedly good schools are requiring 3 vaccines to enter. And I think that's actually not good science, and it's actually against the scientific evidence that we have.
Yeah, I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan, and I saw they, too, are going to require the bivalent. So that's 3 shots, or at least 3 or 4 shots in the fall. And also, he brought up Stéphane Bancel was comparing myocarditis from COVID versus from the vaccine. But of course, the vast majority of people have had or will have COVID. So those are not two things. You can have COVID and get the vaccine. Like, it's not comparing the same thing because the likelihood of having to face the myocarditis risk from COVID is independent of whether you're going to get the vaccine because it's not going to stop you from getting COVID.
Well, like so many scientific debates, there's been some evidence on both sides. So the CDC put forward some studies early on showing that they felt the incidence of COVID or myocarditis after recovering or while recovering from COVID was greater than the vaccine. But what they did is they compared it to the general population. And so if you compare COVID myocarditis after having the virus of COVID to the general population, it was about equal or not much difference. If you select out 16 to 24-year-old males, lo and behold, it's like 30 times greater for those who've been vaccinated. So it was just bad science. And it's not making the acknowledgement that people are different based on their age. Not only are their risks different, their reactions are. So there's also studies now showing the kids or young males that get myocarditis, their free-floating S protein. This is what the mRNA tells your body to make. The S protein from the coronavirus is off the charts. And for some reason, they just get a hyperreactive, response to the vaccine. But the other thing people should know is it's very important that if your child is just recovering from COVID, they have an enormous immune response going on. If you vaccinate them when they're still in the recovery period, you could double up on that enormous immune response, and that's what causes the myocarditis. I think there's been insufficient warning and insufficient discussion by public health doctors as to if your child's already had COVID, immediately going, and I've had doctors tell people on my staff, young people on my staff that have recovered from COVID, have you learned your lesson? Are you going to go get immunized now? And my staff members, a lot of times will respond to them, well, yeah, I just got immunized. That's what the infection was. But It's
Yeah.
actually medically not advised to immediately get a vaccine after you've just recovered from having COVID, particularly for young people.
Well, Senator, we want to give you a chance to respond to something Dr. Fauci said about you during this documentary about him that was just released this week.
Rand Paul was insidiously throwing into his little questions that the work that was done in the Wuhan lab, funded by a small grant from NIH, a strong implication that that created a virus that made COVID. I have 10,000 grants throughout the world. What they've done is that they've looked at various grants and they make something of it that it isn't. The microbe they were working on not only was not SARS-CoV-2, it would be molecularly impossible for them to turn it into SARS-CoV-2. They were so different, it's kind of like you have a Chevrolet and you got a motorcycle. And you say, I want to make that Chevrolet into the motorcycle. No matter what you do to that Chevrolet, you're not going to make it into a motorcycle. Like, what are you talking about?
Can't turn a car into a motorcycle? Case closed. This research could not have caused COVID. Does that make sense to you?
Well, he's arguing a straw man argument. We have never argued that anything that's been published by the Wuhan lab became COVID-19. What we are arguing is that the lab in Wuhan has over 100 coronaviruses that they've manipulated in lab and have not published. We also know that in 2018, they asked the US government for money to do research where they would take a coronavirus and insert a furin cleavage site. A furin cleavage site is a special part of the S protein that allows the virus to infect humans easier. And DARPA turned them down. This is an agency of the Defense Department because they thought it was too dangerous. But we know they were asking to do this, and a year and a half later, lo and behold, we get COVID-19. And what is COVID-19? A coronavirus with a furin cleavage site. So we turn up with a very unusual virus that's not been seen in nature before, that is exactly what they asked us to create a year before. Coincidence? In the city where most all of the world's coronaviruses are stored? Coincidence? I mean, there's just too much going on here. And what we want to do is look at all of the grants, and I've been petitioning the State Department, NIH, HHS, Defense Department, you name it. I've been trying to get information on all of these grants because I want to know what else was either rejected or funded. Dr. Fauci is disingenuous. He is conflicted, and the reason he is conflicted is that if this came from the lab that he funded, he shares culpability. And he's been trying to cover this up from the beginning. There's a great deal of information that from January of 2020, in the early days, a cover-up began, and it continued for Fauci's entire term in office.
Senator, before we let you go quickly, I want to note that last night the Senate voted not to advance your amendment that would end congressional authorization for the use of military force in the global war against terror, turning back your effort to repeal that 2001 measure. Can you talk about that? I'm sure it's disappointing.
Yeah, I've been trying to stop the forever wars, the forever authorizations for war, and most of these are dependent on the 9/11 proclamation. So when we were attacked on 9/11, Congress came, debated, and said, we will go after and declare war on those who attacked us and anybody who harbored them. Well, over the years, that was transformed by people who wanted to continue wars in various parts of the world to mean and justify every war. And so the only way we'll stop the involvement of war in about 20 different countries is to repeal the 9/11 2001 authorization for force. Now, the bill that's currently before us, my amendment failed, and I'm disappointed, but the bill before us will repeal the Iraqi resolution, the one to say that we are authorized to fight against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And the interesting thing about the absurdity is that war's been over for 20 years. That resolution is very specific to Hussein, and we still can't get some of these neocons to vote for it. You got these unreconstructed war hawks who are still for keeping the Iraqi resolution, claiming that it has something to do with Iran. And so I think it'll be good when we finally do, and I think we have the votes to repeal the Iraqi resolution against Hussein, symbolic as it may be, but it's disappointing that we're going to leave one on the books that still allows soldiers to be around the world fighting a continuous war. And my fear is that this vote will be largely symbolic, and not one soldier comes home and not one soldier's life is saved because of this, but at least it's a beginning of the debate.
Senator Paul, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you.
More Rising right after this.